right, first, I was wrong. There, I admitted it. All three of my colleagues here warned me I'd be wrong, and I was last week when I suggested the Liberals' on-again, off-again support of a combat mission would end up on again. I was wrong. So can we please move on now? You got it. Andrew, Chantal, and Bruce all here tonight for a topic always close to our hearts, polls. But first, we've talked Canada's role against ISIS at this table for the past 3 weeks. Parliament voted this week, and the war is now on. So what's your sense of how the debate went, Andrew?
Well, I thought they made the right decision, so I can be accused of some bias here, but I do think that the government won the week. They kept their aims and their ambitions, as they said, very modest. It didn't look like they were overselling it for once. The opposition, I think, had a very tough time actually explaining why this could not be part of the mix of things that Canada was doing. I think the NDP was able to hold on to its base, but if there were a loser in the week, besides maybe yourself, it would be, it would be Justin Trudeau.
Well, it's actually, Chantal wrote a column that got a lot of attention yesterday, calling Justin Trudeau the first casualty of the war.
It's when you write obvious things that you get a lot of play, I suspect. It's easier to call a loser. The Liberals did not do very well in that debate. They were overshadowed not only by the government, and I do think that the government framed its argument, whether you're for or against it, in as efficient a way as it could. I also think that the NDP did with its side of the argument as much as it could. I was frankly surprised to see Justin Trudeau not take part in the House of Commons debate, let someone else take the lead for his party. I was even more surprised to see that the Liberals, the so-called government in waiting, would not, as the NDP did, come up with a motion of their own to say this is our position and this is what we would do in government. Instead, they voted for the NDP. And that led me to write that if you want to know what the Liberals think, go to the NDP website.
Bruce?
Well, Peter, I guess I think that the political consequences for any of the party leaders are something that we'll only know far off in the future. Otherwise, it's really just speculation. I do think that it's been a challenging week for the Liberal leader, probably more challenging than any week that he's had in a long time. And I say that because, in part, the Conservatives, I think, have been quite disciplined about almost underselling this mission. The Prime Minister and other ministers have gone out of their way to say, we're not sure this is going to work. We're not sure that we're going to be able to get out in time. We're not sure that there isn't another better way that we can figure out down the road. But what's your idea if this isn't the one that you embrace? And I think the problem that the Liberal leader finds himself in is that he looks like his alternative is just accusing the Prime Minister of being trigger-happy, which I don't think the Prime Minister really looks like in this. He looks like a reluctant warrior, if a warrior at all. And to some degree, if you put together what Mr. Trudeau has said in the past, you'd say, well, his position is sociology on root causes, which is, I guess, becoming more vindicated as an idea, but also carrying water in towels for people who do the fighting. Unless he explains a more viable strategy, I'm not sure that that's going to help people understand how he would keep Canadians safe and participate as Canada should.
All right. Well, let's get to the topic that we kind of hyped for this week, and it's about polls. 2 years ago, you remember our old colleague, Alan Gregg, one of the country's most famous pollsters, raised some serious questions about the state of the business. And since then, we on this panel have, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, ignored polls, while the controversy has at times continued. So, where are you on polls these days? Bruce is a pollster. Abacus Data is the chairman and has worked at a number of different polling firms over time. So do you want to start this off? Where are you on the state of polling, your business?
Well, the state of polling, as it's covered by the media, I guess, is really is the central part of your question, Peter, and it's not a very good situation, to be absolutely sure. Sometimes I find myself wanting to roll my eyes a little bit about this discussion because the media consume polling information as though it, turn the fire hose of data on us. And of course, the pollsters go, all right, we'll turn the fire hose of data on you. And so there's more of this information coming from more different players using different techniques. And at the same time, there seem to be fewer controls exerted by the editorial functions within these media enterprises. Less scrutiny over the practices and the techniques, less willingness to pause before putting the poll out on a website and say, does it really make sense Are we sure that this was done properly, or is this just another piece of content that we can put out there? So I don't blame the pollsters or the media, but I do think the situation's deteriorated.
Chantal.
Yeah, it is like crack to journalism, right, to consume polls. I find that for what I do, polls are useful, but not on a day-to-day basis. Every single poll that I see is not interesting. I think it's up to people who do analysis to set their own lines. I am not a pollster, but there are things I know I won't. For instance, I do a lot of Quebec stuff. I won't touch a poll that has a small Quebec sample and does not tell me where Francophones vote versus Anglophones. Polls are still a useful tool for journalists, especially when you see a lot of anecdotal evidence, and then you see a different trend in the polls, and it matches that. It helps you kind of figure out that maybe it's not that you ran into a bad bar that was not representative. So I find that they are useful, but they're not something you should just eat whole without looking at what it is you're getting.
Where are you?
There's a lot of people beating up on the profession, including pollsters beating up on each other. They all, slag each other's methods off, et cetera. I do think it's overdrawn. There have been a couple of instances where, as a group, they were wildly wrong. But for the most part, we forget the times when they're actually quite accurate. And there have been lots of examples of that as well. I think as long as observers look at, the average of all the polls rather than just picking on one poll each week, which may absolutely vary, then they're going to be better off. If it were a profession, I'd prefer to beat up on this. It's our own, as seems to be something of a theme emerging here. First of all, we shouldn't be commissioning polls, in my opinion. We implicate ourselves when we do that. We cross a line from reporting on the news to making news. But more importantly, we have a vested interest at that point in hyping the poll. So even if the poll is absolutely worthless, we're still going to report it because we paid money, or at least commissioned to put our name on it.
Yeah, fewer and fewer occasions that they actually pay money.
No, but we shouldn't. I just don't think we should be crossing that line to begin with. And secondly, while it's valid to report on the polls, and they do impart information, and that's part of the mix, particularly during election campaigns, we do it way too much. We get way too excited about all the polls generally. We wind up covering the campaign rather than the election. And I think there's a cautionary note here if we're not even necessarily sure the poll is going to be right.
All right. This week we asked most of the pollsters in Canada, the main ones, what their thought was in terms of this controversy and whether or not Canadians should still believe polls. Got some interesting answers from those who chose to take part. First one is Frank Graves from Ecos Research. Watch this.
It has been an increase in dodgy polling, and the public should be circumspect. But this has been driven, I think, by a proliferation of methods which are focused more on economy than quality, and the media simply don't resource these to the extent they did in the past. You get what you pay for, which leads to my final point, which this is a shame because good quality polling is demanded by the citizenry, an important component of a vibrant democracy. We don't want just the back rooms and corporate can't having access to this. So this problem needs urgent repair.
Chantal, you're agreeing with Frank Graves there.
Yes, I believe that polls are part of things that help light up debates. We saw that first poll that showed the NDP ahead in Quebec. It was a good Quebec pollster. It matched what we saw on the ground. It certainly changed the tenor of the debate. Should we have gone blind into those 2 weeks of campaign? Well, every party would have had that information in its back rooms and would have been free to spin reality because we had no way to check whether what they were telling us was a fact. And polls are not only about the horse race. They tell you things about what people think about issues. If you read the polls now about the Quebec Charter last year, you would see that in some of the substantial questions, the elements of the PQ defeat and its demise were already there.
All right, I want to go on to our next one from Environics, Keith Newman. Watch what Keith has to say.
Polling, when done properly, continues to provide citizens with important information. Without it, we would all be at the mercy of candidates and governments who may claim to have public support they don't actually have. The problem is, polls are not always done properly or reported responsibly. What the public needs most is for the media to do a better job of vetting the surveys when they come out and reporting them in an intelligent way.
Seems to be a theme taking hold there. We heard it from you and Chantal earlier, but also now from the pollsters themselves, that this is less of their problem, more of our problem.
Yeah, they have their own problems. Let's not minimize that. The people who won't answer the phone, people who lie to pollsters. There's a certain proportion do that, particularly on certain issues. People who change their minds in the last 48 hours. It used to be people, voted the way their dad did or the way their ethnic group or their religious affiliation did. People are much more free agents now, for good and ill, and some of that is they make up their mind at the last moment.
They also changed their minds.
And they change their minds. And I just want to add one point just on this thing about reporting polls during elections. You do get people saying, well, we should just ban them all. There's this bandwagon effect. People will just vote the way that the people are. There's little evidence that that's actually true. But even if it were, that's democracy. People get to vote for any reason they choose. And it's not for us to say, no, you're not voting for the right reason that we've decided. So I do think that even though we over-report them, they should be reported.
Yeah, we choose at CBC not to commission polls during a campaign. We do report on kind of a weekly basis the collection of polls that have come out that week. Bruce, I want you to respond to what Christian Bork from Leger has to say here.
Well, I hear comments all the time saying that polls are not reliable anymore. I think it's largely voters who have become unreliable. Half of them will not actually vote on voting day, yet we've polled them throughout the campaign, making our job tougher as well. Party loyalty is a thing of the past. People will change their minds during election time, and about a third of Canadians actually make up their minds in that last 20 to 48 hours before the actual vote, when we have stopped polling. As an industry, this is making our job a lot tougher.
All right, I find that claim really fascinating and interesting. True? You finding that too?
Oh, for sure, that is true. I tend to feel that is just isolating on one aspect of how polls should be judged. And I'm certainly where Andrew is, that there's a lot of information that polls are providing that are important bits of context. And so if everything gets reduced to, well, some would call it a science of voter turnout models that turn into seat prediction models, then yes, everybody's in for a bad ride in the polling industry, because we do have a problem of accuracy that is born of declining response rates. It manifests itself in the point that Christian Bork was raising about what happens on election days and how well can we predict who's actually going to go out and vote. But it's a bigger and longer term problem. Part of the challenge for pollsters isn't just the relationship with the media, where media are basically saying, get me a poll, make it free, do it in a day, and could you try to make it a little bit sensational, which is a problem because it leads to news making by polls rather than enlightening by polls. It is this whole question.
Have you ever had a media organization call you and say,
And if you did, don't make
it
that
sensational?
Well, no, I'm paraphrasing, but words were certainly very close, very similar to those. And I understand that in the news business, there is sometimes a desire for something to be happening, especially if people are doing tracking polls. But I think it's incumbent upon both parties in a relationship like that to step back and say, are we doing the right thing, or are we doing the convenient thing, the kind of expected thing, the competitive thing in the marketplace? And that's the dynamic I think that we need to be careful about.
The really dodgiest polls are the ones that are commissioned by interest groups and advocacy groups that are, again, you see every day in the papers, where the Coalition for Subsidizing Widgets will commission a poll showing that 85% of Canadians think we should subsidize widgets. They don't tell you, and I'm not saying a very important cause. I'm not saying the poll is made up, but what you don't find out are all the other polls they commissioned where they didn't get the response or the answer they wanted because they didn't ask the right question, or all those other questions. So people should really look sideways at those kinds of polls.
Okay, I got a minute left. If you have a piece of advice for viewers on polls, what would it be, Chantal?
To look around. Most viewers who are interested are people who are engaged politically and in their community, to look around and see if it matches what they see outside. Because I've had this rule that if a poll surprises me in federal politics, I'm probably not doing my job.
Bruce?
I think Andrew put his finger on one thing, which is to look at an average of polls, and CBC, among other organizations, doing more of that. I think that's really good. And also to look at the tradecraft, the design of questions. Poorly designed questions will beget bad information, either deliberately or accidentally, but that's something that people can judge too.
Last word.
Remember that it's only a snapshot in time. It tells you what people responded to on that question on that day. It's important for everybody, the players and the politicians and the press and everyone else, to look at why did they answer that way. For example, if people are now saying 38% are going to vote Liberal, that may or may not mean they're going to vote Liberal come election day. It just means that on the day, that's what they were saying.
Exactly. It's not a predictor.
Not a predictor.
It tells you what happened in the past. Thank you all. Fascinating conversation.